Okay.
Resolve. The United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. This is my framework now. So my value is societal welfare or the well-being of a society. My criterion is cost-benefit analysis. Under this criterion, you should weigh the costs and benefits of an action. If the benefits outweigh the costs, then you should take that action. And my definition is, I have one definition. Promotion, the act of encouraging something to happen or develop. My sole contention is that democracy promotion in the Middle East reestablishes U.S. hegemony. U.S. hegemony in the Middle East is disastrously low. This is written by Bob Dreyfus. Influence of the United States in the broader Middle East and its ability to shape events there is in a death spiral. Washington's actual standing in country after country, including its chief allies in the region, has never been weaker. Not only does no one there respect the United States, but no one really fears it. America's previously unchallenged hegemony in the Middle East is in freefall. Oil-consuming nations like China and India have become more engaged with their suppliers, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. Things are fast becoming unglued for the United States. Its two closest allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are sullenly hostile, routinely ignoring Obama's advice and openly oppose American policies. 3 successive regimes have flouted U.S. wishes. It is not every day that America finds itself facing open rebellion from its allies, yet that is what is happening with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. Movement to oust President Bashar al-Assad developed into a civil war that the United States has demonstrated its utter inability to guide events. Instead of finding himself leading a George W. Bush-style coalition with Democratic support, Obama watched his allies scattered, including the usually reliable British and the Arab League. At home, political support was nearly nil and evaporated from there. Polls showed Americans overwhelmingly opposed to a war with or attack on Syria. When in desperation, the president appealed to Congress for a resolution to authorize the use of military force against that country. The White House found, to its surprise, that Congress would normally rubber stamp such proposals would have none of it. Next door, in the country whose government was installed by the United States after the 2003 invasion, the Obama administration notoriously failed to convince the Iraqis to allow even a small contingent of American troops to remain there past 2011. Since then, that country has moved ever more firmly into Iran's orbit and has virtually broken with Washington over Syria. So my link is promoting democracy is critical to maintain stability and continued U.S. presence in the Middle East. A freer and more democratic world helps create a virtuous circle of improved security, stronger economic growth, and durable alliances, all of which better serve the long-term interests of the United States. Accountable, effective, and democratic governments make better and more reliable trading partners and provide the cornerstones of international stability. America's official investments in promoting democracy and governance abroad deserve to be sustained. Because of their benefits, to and strong reflection of America's longest-standing values, international democracy and governance programs have historically enjoyed bipartisan support in the past decade. However, this support has undergone strain in the wake of the war in Iraq. Given the recent democratic openings in the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, however, we are again reminded of the value of people-driven programs to assist civil society and accountable governance. Broader democratic promotion can have a powerful effect in making overall development efforts more effective. A number of important studies further substantiate the central importance of political freedom and good governance in promoting long-term economic prosperity while advancing U.S. priorities. If they fail, the cause of democracy will set back and we will live in a darker world. Women, minority, and religious groups are seeking our help to ensure that their voices are heard. Finally, there are a number of countries that continue to repress their own citizens in ways that are almost unthinkable in the 21st century. We need to work with labor unions, church groups, civil society organizations, and the private sector, dissident groups, and diasporas to ensure that positive change happens and that societies can create governments that are responsive, accountable, and respectful of human rights. Promoting free and accountable governance is both morally and substantively imperative. Subpoint A is the first scenario. Low hegemony leads to a multipolarity in the Middle East. A recent arms deal between Russia and Syria has raised the prospect of a new Cold War in the Middle East. Regional powers such as Russia and Turkey are increasing their influence at the United States' expense. There was a new triple alliance between Syria, Turkey, and Iran, with Russia now cast in the role as superpower benefactor. Like Russia, Turkey is pursuing its own interests by asserting its influence in the whole Middle East, not just as the linchpin of anti-American/Israel bloc. Though Washington remains the world's only superpower, the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan have exposed the limits of U.S. ambitions. While the Bush era saw the U.S. hegemonic in the region, squeezing the divide and feel like Syria and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, today's Middle East sees a power vacuum led by partial U.S. retreat being filled by assertive regional and middle powers. If the age of American unipolarity is coming to an end, perhaps hastened by the unnecessary wars and economic short-sightedness, it's much more likely that international relations in the Middle East will come to will come to reflect the multipolar world that will follow rather than revert to a bipolar Cold War. It won't just be Russia and Turkey expanding their reach in the region, but China, India, and Brazil will also bid for a role too, presumably having fewer demands in Washington about their clients pursuing democratic reform and peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia's growing relationship with China might signify the shape of things to come. The impact is that loss of U.S. hegemony would leave behind a power vacuum, spurring terrorism, economic turmoil, and multiple nuclear wars. Waning empires, religious revivals, and incipient anarchy are the dark age experiences the world without hyperpower might quickly find itself reliving. Friction is bound to be more frequent. Technology has upgraded destruction. The reversal of globalization, which a new dark age would produce, would certainly lead to economic stagnation and even depression. Europe's Muslim enclaves grew. Islamist extremist infiltration of the EU would become irreversible, increasing transatlantic tensions over the Middle East to the breaking point. An economic meltdown in China would plunge the communist system into crisis, unleashing the centrifugal forces that undermined previous Chinese empires.
Okay. So for cross-sex. So Huh? Okay. Okay, so in your speech you say something about like women needing their voice to be heard and things of this nature of like human rights violations. So how would promoting democracy actually like change these violations from happening?
This is mainly about minority groups in the area because with the democratic society, when the people are picking a representative, this would at least allow the minority groups to be heard better.
Okay. But if it were the minority groups picking, then if we're talking about majorities versus minorities in democratic elections, how would minorities have enough say to shift government?
What do you mean?
So, like, you basically stated just in your response that, like, minorities could be able to, like, pick a representative in the to represent them. So, if we're thinking about the majority needs versus the minority needs, how is a smaller amount of people going to, even if all of them voted, have a substantial effect that could shift the government enough to hear their rights?
Okay, my value is societal welfare, and the criterion is cost-benefit analysis. So we have to weigh the costs and the benefits of an action. So even if the costs maybe, pretty much having a democracy in the Middle Eastern countries over a dictatorship or like groups of terror enforcing their rules or laws, it would be better to have It would be better to have a democratic government because that would at least represent more people than just what one person wants.
Okay. Could you clarify your sub A?
Sub A.
Yes.
Okay. So low hegemony leads to 1 second. Okay, so it's low hegemony leads to multipolarity in the Middle East. So basically, it's saying that it explains that Russia and Syria they have an arms deal, and that regional powers such as Russia and Turkey are increasing their influence in the Middle East, and that's basically making the U.S. less popular in the Middle East, and we don't want that because that takes away from like the U.S. hegemony, and that's low hegemony, which does lead to multipolarity in the Middle East.
Okay, I have no more questions. So. Okay. I am just going to go on to my case. Okay. Okay. I negate the U.S. ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. I'd like to clarify the resolution with some definitions. Promote is to further progress of something, support or actively encourage. Democracy is a representative democracy, one in which the representatives are elected by the people. We use this definition because implying that the U.S. is an actor implies that we follow the U.S. democracy system. The value for this debate is justice, as the purpose of this debate is to prove whether or not the U.S. has a moral obligation to promote democracy to create a more just social standing. The criterion of this debate is maximizing the quality of life through minimizing inequality. The judge should vote for whoever best minimizes inequality. Thus, I contend that the promotion of democracy in the Middle East would be detrimental to the welfare of society. Contention 1. Democracy produces violence against marginalized populations, guaranteeing systematic inequality and discrimination. Democracy has many ethical defects. The treatment of minorities is perhaps the most recognized defect of democracies. Between the mid-1930s and the mid-1970s, the Swedish government forcibly sterilized thousands of women because of mental defects or simply because they were mixed race. Yet Sweden has been a model democracy for the entire period. The problem is that democracy offers no protection to marginalized and despised minorities. No constitutional rights are absolute. President Bush showed how easy it is to overturn fundamental constitutional protections. Simply by redefining some American citizens as illegal enemy combats, he was able to intern them. The Australian government detains asylum seekers in internment camps in the desert. Its hard line accurately reflects the attitudes of a racist electorate. Basic rights allow wide limits. Treatments of minorities may be harsh and humiliating without infringing upon their rights. A recent example in the Netherlands is a proposal to impose compulsory genital inspections of ethnic minorities. The aim is to combat female genital mutilation, but every ethnic Somali parent, regardless of their own circumstances, would be obliged to present their daughters for annual genital inspection. It is not law yet, but since Somalis are a marginalized and often despised minority in the Netherlands, there is nothing that they can do to prevent its implementation. Democracy allows a democratic majority to impose its will on a minority. Successful prohibition movements are a special case of the inherent anti-minority bias in democracies. There is a more general effect. It is very difficult for an innovative minority to succeed in democracy, and a minority first proposes most innovations. Like many political systems, democracy has an inherent bias towards the existing as against the possible. A large-scale example of failed innovation in democracies is the European high-speed rail network first proposed in the 1970s. Since then, not even planned national networks have been completed. The pan-European project failed primarily due to the lack of political enthusiasm, but it should be abandoned simply because there is insufficient will of the people. If an innovation has no democratic mandate, then a democracy will not implement it. Contention 2, the only possible way to achieve a just society is by rejecting democracy. Democracy is susceptible to demagoguery, lobbying, and corruption. All forms of democracy fall prey to demagogues, easier to seize any opportunity to advance their own claims by manufacturing consent of the monetary fear, hope, anger, and confusion of the general public. Representational democracy has a special vulnerability to lobbying. Special interest groups send extremely well-paid people after elected representatives to persuade, threaten, barter, or bribe them into delivering legislation, government funding, or other favors to their group. Elected officials have many vested interests beyond the will of the people when they take office. These are also symptoms of problems that arise when individuals are turned into passive spectators in a decision-making process, or when individual involvement in creating one's own environment is reduced to mere opinion choosing. Democracy only offers the choice of relieving yourself of oppression by becoming the oppressor. Freedom lies in the entire institution's abolition. Those who cast the votes decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. Contention 3, rejecting democracy is workable and possible. The outcome of the democratic process can be improved. The right to vote is the best example since it is still considered the core political right of the individuals in the democracies. Bill Gates has an individual right to vote as a U.S. citizen. That includes the so-called passive voting rights, the right to stand as a candidate for political office, to receive votes of others, and to be elected. But Gates is also the world's richest man. Even without his connection to Microsoft, his influence on the U.S. government is almost certainly more than that of the million poorest voters in the USA. The exercise of his individual vote in elections will not change that. So why should he have the right to vote? In practice, the rich or some other categories have a double and more than that double vote. Depriving them of formal voting rights partly corrects this structural injustice in Western democracies. The conservative effects on democracy can be reduced by prohibiting conservative parties, including associated conservative think tanks and lobby organizations. In the U.S., many organizations openly describe themselves as conservative. The Heritage Foundation database lists over 300 of them. Religious parties which seek to impose the principles of a religion on non-believers should also be forbidden, and that would include all European Christian democratic parties. Democracies filter and restrict innovation. Exemptions from the democratic process and in such cases allow the innovation to proceed without it. In Europe, exemption could apply to infrastructure planning in general and specific infrastructure projects which would remain unbuilt in a market democracy. Reform of the units of the local government, where localist and traditionalist opposition preserves the obsolete territorial divisions, spatial planning in general, including demographic and regional planning. And so for all these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote in favor of the negation. Now on to my opponent's case. So my opponent's case is based on this one contention, off of their point that that democracy is actually going to reestablish U.S. hegemony. We would like to state that this is not necessarily, or I would like to state that this is not necessarily true, because U.S. hegemony is something that is not going to be reinstated simply by putting a democratic system in place because of the fact that U.S. hegemony has so many other factors behind it, especially when we have really negative relations with the Middle East. And since this plan, or since this resolution does not help to reinstate American democracy in other types, in countries in the Middle East in which there is already some kind of a democracy. So also, U.S. hegemony is not necessarily a good thing because, as I've stated in my case, there is a huge systematic problem with U.S. democracy as it is now, with our 50% voter turnover, meaning that 50% of people don't vote in elections. There is no reason why we should promote this kind of a U.S. democracy. So actually, it is not going to reestablish hegemony because it's an ineffective form of government. Now, onto another one of their points about the human rights abuses. And they basically stated that reinstituting democracy is going to help minorities get their voice heard. However, this is not true because the democracy actually oppresses minorities. It oppresses women, and generally, my opponent stated that basically the cost-benefit analysis, democracy is better, a representative democracy is better than terrorism. However, the impact of this is faulty because democracy won't do what we're saying it's going to do. It's instead going to take the U.S. corruption and put it over there to an already resistant society. And for all these reasons, I urge you to vote NEG. I stand for cross-X. Okay. Okay.
So you say something about conservatives being bad and that we should get rid of conservative groups and other religious groups or something like that. First of all, can you clarify that a little bit? And second of all, is that a plan of getting rid of them, or is it just like we should just get rid of them?
So this is something that is not a formal plan or counterplan text, as I am the negation, and in this case, this is not a plan text. However, we are simply saying that I am saying in this evidence that rather than democracy, like I'm not saying that this idea of democracy in the form of a plan text would have to include taking out conservative groups. I'm simply saying that these conservative groups, because of their weight and their ability to essentially garner votes, actually takes away from the moral and the ethical values of
about, like, conservative groups or religious groups.
Right.
You're saying that these like is that like a target of people's ideology or belief, or is that just like these groups should just be eradicated because I don't agree with them? That's
not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that these groups, they essentially take from the ethical and moral values of democracy because of the fact that they tend to have more money. They tend to have just generally more political kind of value, and so their vote is a lot more kind of effective in terms of getting someone into office. So the system ends up becoming extremely corrupt. And this isn't necessarily part of a plan text, but just saying that democracy can't work because of this.
Okay. So how does any other type of government, other than democracy, how does it, like, what in the Middle East right now represents minorities better? How is the status quo better?
So I'm not saying that
you're pretty much defending the status quo by saying that if we enforce democracies, that's going to be really bad for minorities. How is anything right now better?
So the thing is that democracy is not going, if we're going on this cost-benefit analysis thing here, promoting democracy is not going to help people in the Middle East, because what democracy does is essentially promotes the majority becoming higher in power and the minority becoming lower in power. And so this is going to become even more apparent. This inequality is going to become even more apparent when we put this democratic system in place.
So the status quo is better than possible democracy?
If we're going by the standards of American democracy, then yes.
In the Middle East right now?
In the non-democratic Middle Eastern states, yes.
How?
Oh, time's up.
I have 6 more seconds.
Oh.
That's fine.
Okay. So the next speech...
You turned on yourself, right?
use up a minute 38 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, 4 minutes. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. In my opponent's one A's or in my opponent's one NC, she talks about getting rid of conservative and religious groups as they hold a really high like they're able to influence the elections a lot more, and I believe that this is actually extremely not correct to say that. Like, okay, sorry. Okay, saying that conservatives, like the conservative groups and religious groups are bad is not fair to them, and that's extremely rude to them, and it's actually extremely demeaning in my opinion, saying that these groups are just bad because they hold a lot of influence over elections currently, and that's not fair to them, and that's, in my opinion, that's not correct to say. Also, when I asked the question in cross-examination, how does any other type of government, how do they represent minorities better than a democracy? So my opponent is pretty much defending the status quo of the Middle Eastern countries that don't have a democracy. And right now, if you think about it, status quo represents a group like the Islamic State, where in the United States we recognize them as a terrorist group, and all the territory that they've taken over in their name as the Islamic State, anything in that territory cannot be justified as a good thing due to the fact that they're killing people. Like, if they don't agree with, if the people disagree with whatever the Islamic State says, they're killing them. And I don't see how that's any better than promoting democracy in the Middle East. And a promotion of democracy is what the people would want. And the people aren't necessarily going to put the Islamic State in power, and pretty much anything as I see it is better than being killed and like having your family killed or having other people killed. Also, my opponent's criterion is minimalizing inequality, and as of the status quo right now, where I talk about the Islamic State as like a big example, I don't see how putting the U.S. promoting democracy in the Middle East is gonna hurt is gonna hurt justice in the Middle East, and I don't see how defending the status quo is minimizing inequality, because the status quo right now has a lot of inequality in the Middle East, as these groups like the Islamic State are killing anybody who disagrees with them, and that is inequality in the sense. So I don't see how promoting democracy in the Middle East is making that any worse. So therefore, I affirm the resolution.
Okay. And
You have 6 minutes.
yeah, so since this is my final speech, can I use prep time?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
You time yourself.
Yeah, so it's 4 minutes?
Yep.
Okay. Everybody ready to judge? Okay. So in this final speech, I am going to first I'm going to, just to give you a roadmap, I'm going to go over the points that have been going around in this debate, and then I'm going to convince you, Judge, that you should vote in favor of the negation. So off of some points that have just been kind of circulating in this debate, so my opponent stated that that in my 1 and C, I stated that we need to get rid of conservative groups because it's rude, it's bad, it's not fair to them, it's demeaning. However, these are all emotional arguments, and they're simply not correct because I have evidence that actually shows that yes, indeed, these conservative groups do impinge on democracy to such an extent that democracy cannot truly exist with these types of groups because they essentially act as another party that can convince voters with money and other means to vote in a certain way that actually detracts from the equal representation of the democracy, because a rich vote essentially does count for so many more votes than a poor vote because of all of the influence that these groups have. So as I have this evidence and as all of these refutations are simply emotional arguments, I would strongly say that this does not flow through. Next, on the point that that my opponent asked a question: how is any government better than what is going on in the Middle East, essentially? And they stated that I am defending the status quo. They even brought up ISIS in this. This was not brought up in their first speech, so I believe that as per LD rules, it should not flow through. But even if you do want to count this argument as something germane to the structure of debate, I would like to say that democracy is not going to do anything to help stop ISIS. ISIS is a terrible terrorist group that is going to kill mass amounts of people no matter what, especially because ISIS is a group that is anti-Western civilization and things that we do here in the West, including democracy. ISIS is something that, if anything, would be extremely enraged by this kind of an idea, and so democracy actually isn't going to help solve ISIS. As it's just going to bring more corruption, it might be completely useless in stopping ISIS, or it might bring about even more corruption, so this point should not flow through. Next, they also stated that on their criterion about minimizing inequality, they basically cited ISIS again, which I've already refuted. They've stated that there's lots of inequality, there's lots of killing, and essentially that there are all of these bad things going on in the Middle East, and that there's anything can be better than the status quo. However, I'd like to state again that the affirmation has yet to prove that anything, including enforcing democracy in the Middle East, is actually going to change this. There are democratic societies in the Middle East, and that is actually where a lot of the corruption that you hear about in the news happens, because there still are out of the 3 main governments in the Middle East, 2 of them actually are democracies, and that hasn't worked out so well for them. So putting more democracy into the area that doesn't have democracy when everything is unstable simply is not going to help the issue. So now, in these last few minutes of the speech, Judge, I will convince you that you should vote in the negation of this resolution. So the first reason being that promoting democracy won't only be useless, but might actually be harmful, especially to these terrorist groups who hate anything that has to do with America, anything that has to do with Western anything. This is going to just cause more rage, if anything else, and essentially, if anything else, or if nothing else, is rather just going to do nothing to solve these human rights abuses. And so the affirmations case is purely based off of the idea, the flawed premise, that essentially promoting democracy is going to get all these human rights abuses away from happening. Their entire case is about U.S. hegemony essentially being a good thing. However, I would like to state that as the U.S., our democracy isn't working out that well either. So us being the leader, not only is this statement extremely imperialist, but this is essentially going to make it so that we are forcing our corrupt ways onto another corrupt government, and it is not our moral duty to cause more corruption. And so Another reason, Judge, that you should vote for us on the negation is for the reason that the affirmation has not provided sufficient examples to prove their criterion, which is the cost-benefit analysis, or that societal welfare can be achieved, and especially that democracy is the way to do it. And so, basically, in this debate, they've basically said over and over that They basically just talked about human rights abuses. They've talked about ISIS, brought up this new point. They said that there is an impact of terrorism, nuclear war, other terrible things from happening. However, they have not provided sufficient evidence to say that democracy is going to change the course of any of this. So, also, this point definitely should not flow through. There is nothing to say. We can look to other Middle Eastern countries as a guide to see whether or not democracy would work there. There are still two of these predominant governments that are democratic, and so we can see that corruption still exists there. We can see that democracy is corrupt here. It's corrupt in Switzerland. Everywhere it is always going to be corrupt. And so we can't say that any of these human rights abuses are not going to happen. And since this is the majority of their case, Judge, I urge you to vote in favor of the negation. And because as the negation, we fulfill this weighing mechanism of kind of promoting less inequality. There's actually going to be more inequality if we institute democracy, because these large businesses are going to have more of a say than the people do. And for this reason, Judge, I urge you to vote in favor of the negation.
Cool. Okey-dokey. 3 minutes.
So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge a few points that I actually am allowed to add in information in my 1AR. And also I'd like to state that my opponent says that it's not demeaning or unfair to eradicate these groups because of what they do to democracy, but it still is, because you're just getting rid of them, and there's no specific plan text to say you're literally just saying, let's just get rid of them because they're bad. But that's unfair and demeaning to them, because you really provide no reason other than they hurt democracy, which is still demeaning to them by saying they're just bad. Also, so now I want to get to why I win. My opponent never provides any evidence as to why the status quo is better than the resolution. She defends the status quo, which is not good in the first place, and at least in the world of the app, it has a chance of improving, whereas in the status quo, it just keeps getting worse, and that's what's happening. One second. My impacts are far greater than anything that my opponent proposes, and the possibility that a loss of U.S. hegemony, would spur economic turmoil and multiple nuclear wars is actually a valid argument, because when when there's no U.S. So friction is bound to be more frequent, and the reversal of globalization, which a new dark age would produce, would certainly lead to economic stagnation and even depression. As Europe's Muslim enclaves grow, Islamist extremist infiltration of the EU would become irreversible, leading to transatlantic tension over the Middle East to the breaking point, and an economic meltdown in China, and that would be caused by the current status quo, or like a loss of U.S. hegemony. An economic meltdown in China would plunge the Atlantic tensions over the Middle East to the breaking point. Sorry, I said that. And this would make communist systems go into crisis, unleashing the centrifugal forces that undermined the previous Chinese empires. And this is bad because because U.S. and China already have their own extremely important trade relationship right now, and if that goes away, there's nothing stopping China from attempting to take over this global hegemony, which is obviously good for them, and that's pretty bad. So really, I won this debate because my impacts are far greater, and my opponent doesn't provide sufficient evidence to say that the status quo is better than a possible democracy of the resolution.